International political parties affect the world in ways people would never expect. People would think it would be a conspiracy, but it's a massive effect on our everyday lives, whether it's local and city levels, state or international, or even national politics. And these can be controlled by international political parties where varied interests, wealthy interests mostly, coordinate their policies across countries. Now, of course, these are all run by sort of invested interests. Of course, if you're going to have a global or international party for conservatives, you're going to have to fund it. If you're going to have an international party for liberals, you're going to have to fund that too. And so liberal billionaires and conservative billionaires kind of have it out through the two major parties in different countries, which is why most countries that are democracies reflect a two-party system. Sometimes there's a third party, which is usually by the kids of wealthy people. But basically, think of international political parties as either generally liberal or conservative globally. And now those words are very interchangeable because what is a conservative in London or may be considered a hardcore liberal in America, because you can be a conservative and support gun control. You can be conservative and be a big environmentalist and pro climate change or reducing emissions on corporations. You can be a conservative and still believe in universal health care. So these terms are interchangeable, but nonetheless, you do see common threads of coordinated policy. Even though there are these variances, overall, the overarching structure is the same. And they even use the same leaflets, the same printouts when they introduce legislations from the same companies that are giving them money. So there is definitely coordination, although it does vary to a degree on the national level in different countries, and as well as local and city. But nonetheless, these are international political parties. There's an international Green Party, which helps coordinate environmental policies and has made a lot of progress in bringing those issues to the forefront in Australia, in the EU, in America, even in China, where they're now the biggest investors in solar technology. So these policies are all coordinated, and the activists amongst them are usually selected to be at the forefront depending on how they do in the media. And their names will become more or less prominent depending on what the funders think and how they're doing with their public appearances. And so usually these donors, the donor class of international political parties, are really the decision makers when it comes down to what happens on the ground. Now, of course, those activists and those leaders of parties do affect the implementation of policies, but the overall narrative, the overall goals are usually established by those giving them money and paying their salary, which makes sense, of course. Black Lives Matter is an example of this. During the Obama administration, there was the conservative funding for the Tea Party and how billionaire class pretty much single-handedly legitimized this movement and brought it to the forefront of the national media, helped fund it, helped pick leaders and spokesmen of it, and train them and bring them to counseling sessions and basically get them on the narrative of the funders. And they did a pretty good job of bringing up some issues of like funding issues and discrepancies in spending and how there's been a giant waste in certain departments and these sorts of things and infringements on individual rights, which are all big issues. And then during the Trump administration, the same billionaire class of the liberal faction has funded the Black Lives Matter movement and given out hundreds of millions of dollars, billions of dollars now, more recently, because of its success in the media and its activists that it's selected. And so that is also bringing legitimate concerns to the forefront of the media on political reform of the prison system, which is the largest in the world and completely disproportionate to what it should be in the population. Way too much. And also on the police brutality and how that can be improved through training, or in some more fringe versions, the defunding movement of reallocating resources under the positive version of that to other community resources like therapists who can help with mentally ill people who are in a state of distress, these sorts of things. But nonetheless, these overarching policies and why you see something like a minor supposedly new, quote, quote, international political party, which actually is direct offshoots of Acorn and former liberal institutions that have been getting hundreds of millions of dollars for decades, But yeah, it's new because it selected some new faces to go to conferences and to make public appearances, but new somehow, even though they have the same donors for 30 or 40 years. Nonetheless, they do bring up legitimate issues, but that's also why it's global, because it has the same donors that stretch their funds into all the countries in which they have interest, which is Australia, South Africa, London, and Western Europe, and even in Japan and some small cohorts, very small comparatively, and even in South America, where some of the ones who worked in these large institutions, global institutions, have gone home and made their own chapters so that they can get funding. And not to say these aren't legitimate, they do push real issues, they do help real people sometimes, but that overarching narrative being dictated by a donor class delegitimizes the actual action on the ground, because it's not based on data, it's not based on science, it's based on popular opinion, what looks good in the media, and what gets more donations to fuel the cycle that creates these foundations that never really spend the bulk of their money to help people. They just kind of have small interests that they put in the bank, and then they work off the interest so that the foundation can last hundreds of years beyond the guy who founded it, like the Ford Foundation, who supported Black Lives Matter and gave them hundreds of millions of dollars. These foundations, although they do a lot of good work in a lot of countries, they overall have a sort of institutional bias, because once you create an organization, its first job is to continue existing. Like all living things, life wants to keep living. And so once you create these things, their first priority is self-preservation. So that's why all the funds sit in a bank account, and only a small percentage are used to actually help people. And these percentages are usually given to activists, which you get media, which get more donors, which then leads to more foundations, which then leads to more money sitting in the bank, which then leads to a small percentage going to activists, who then create another media cycle for more funding. And so you get more and more foundations. There's like a plethora of new foundations, all at the $1 million, multi-million dollar, $100 million, $1 billion level, but you don't really see any more action on the ground. And human population is increasing. Social pressures are increasing. Environmental degradation is increasing. All these things are escalating, but the solutions are getting smaller and smaller and smaller under a smaller and smaller financial group, which is funding both international political parties in most countries through donors, and most nonprofits. It's all through the same class of people. Now there needs to be more ordinary people involved in these decisions, more people who aren't wealthy, who are just average citizens who can make a difference. And I do believe that like movements like Black Lives Matter, or the environmental movement, or even the conservative movements for regulating finances and not blowing these expenditures are aimed at helping everyday people. I just wish that more of them were included in the leadership and making the major decisions. Now, of course, saying this and it requires proof. So here are some examples of international political parties. Here's some examples of organizations they fund.